On that fateful night, when the RMS Titanic plunged into the icy Atlantic, it wasn't only 1,500 lives that were lost. Accompanying the human tragedy, a wealth of material treasures and precious cargo sank to the ocean floor. Opulent luggage and locked safes plummeting into the dark water below. Beloved pets swimming futilely. Mailbags spilling millions of letters into the sea, all vanishing beneath the waves forever. These artifacts and goods, some of immense monetary and cultural value, went down with the unsinkable ship. In the immediate aftermath, as the world grappled with the human cost, many also pondered the fate of the Titanic's cargo. What priceless artworks, rare books, jewels, and everyday goods were aboard, and what became of those items? How did their loss reverberate at the time? That is what we're here to talk about, an often overlooked aspect of the Titanic story. So, allow me first to welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like and comment, which helps push us out to more people, and more people can enjoy this. Fight the brain rot on YouTube, that kind of thing. Also, you will have no interruptions in this video or indeed any other videos on the channel because it's all mid-roll free for your entertainment and the ideal learning experience. How is such a thing possible? Well, it is possible due to the generous contributions of the Patreon and YouTube members supporting us through that. Also, we have the occasional super thanks and PayPal donation, along with the merch store, which has plenty of nice, precious goodies of their own. And if you'd like to support or have a look at any of those avenues out of curiosity alone, then you can follow the links in the pinned comment, video description, and the channel description on the front page. Thank you very much. And now, without further ado, let's start the video for today. Well, think about it this way first. The Titanic was primarily a luxury passenger liner, but not many people know that it served also as a cargo ship, as a lot of them did at the time. Now, as a Royal Mail ship, RMS, that's what that stands for, by the way, it carried mail, and in fact an estimated 6 to 9 million pieces of mail went down with the Titanic on that night, along with 700 to 800 parcels. In addition to mail bags, the Titanic's loading manifests show a wide array of freight and personal baggage entrusted to the ship's holds. There were dozens of crates and barrels filled with commercial goods, cases of fine wine, champagne, stacks of leather and rubber, which at the time rubber was quite the commodity, piles of raw silk, linens, and even 40 tons of fresh meat and other foodstuffs meant for the ship's kitchens or consignment in New York. The Titanic was a floating microcosm of transatlantic trade. High-class freight, that's what some newspapers termed it. Yet among this ordinary cargo were some truly extraordinary shipments. In first-class baggage rooms and cargo holds alike, irreplaceable treasures were packed for the voyage. Wealthy passengers had brought aboard expensive personal belongings, and several shipments of great value were being transported as freight. For instance, tucked securely in the forward storage was a shiny new Renault Type CB limousine, a custom 1912 model automobile, made to order, one of a kind. First-class passenger William E. Carter had decided to send his family's Renault car along the Titanic, a decision that would make a car one of the most storied automobiles in history for all the wrong reasons. And it was also valued at around $5,000 at the time, equivalent to around $150,000 in 2025 terms. The car shared the hold with cases of machinery and auto parts, After the sinking, that Renault became famous as the Titanic car, immortalized in movies and curiosity ever since, a rare case where even a mundane cargo item gained mystique from the disaster. But beyond vehicles, the Titanic carried luxurious household items and products catering for the tastes of the elite. For example, there were reputedly 40 crates of exotic feathers, plumes from ostriches and other birds, bound for the fashion houses of New York. Well, in the Edwardian era, these feathers were worth their weight in gold, almost literally by weight. Only diamonds were more valuable than bird of paradise or ostrich feathers in 1912. These crates were insured for a staggering amount, estimated at over $2 million, and that's in 1912 money for the whole shipment. But why such value? Well, you see, at the time, women's hats, lavishly adorned with feathers, were the height of fashion. Entire ostrich plumes or arrangements of exotic bird feathers could fetch a man a small fortune if he was in that trade. The loss of this shipment in the Titanic was a severe blow to the millinery trade. It's an almost poetic image of the era's extravagance. Some of the finest plumes destined to crown the ladies of high society's heads, instead scattered under water, never again to ornament a hat. What a waste. But in a way, the end of the Titanic foreshadowed the end of that feather craze, and indeed within a few years, changing styles and World War I would collapse the feather market, certainly to the relief of exotic birds everywhere, one would only imagine. But in April 1912, the immediate concern was just financial. Insurers and merchants counted the loss of those feathers as the single most expensive commercial cargo loss on the ship. The Titanic also transported mail and parcels as part of its Royal Mail contract. Its 5 postal clerks, 2 British, 3 American, bravely stayed below deck trying to save mail bags until the very last moments. None of them survived. Well, if it was me, I would have been leaving the letters behind, I suppose, but different times, I suppose. In any case, the scale of the lost mail was unprecedented. Contemporary estimates put it up to 3,500 sacks of mail, including registered mail with valuables. In one contemporary account, around 200 sacks of registered mail, holding perhaps 1.6 million letters, and over 3,000 sacks of regular mail were on board. Together, possibly 7 million letters and hundreds of packages lost. And that's an astonishing thought. Personal letters, business contracts, love notes, invoices, catalogues, all sunk and waterlogged on the seabed. For weeks after, some letters from the Titanic did wash up or were recovered from victims' pockets, but these were quite few. The vast majority of its correspondence was all but gone. Businesses had to resend orders. Families knew letters to lost loved ones would never be read. And one headline even read, "Can Titanic's mail ever be delivered?" Well, a sadly ironic question, as delivery was impossible. In the wreck, some of those letters still remain in the mail room, now part of the historical record of the disaster. But perhaps more intriguing than the commercial goods were the one-of-a-kind cultural treasures that were aboard. The Titanic's manifest included items of fine art and literature that, once lost, left a permanent void. And one famous example is a lavishly bound edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book that came to be nicknamed the Great Omar. Now, this was no ordinary book of poetry. It was an exquisite custom binding created by London bookbinders Sangorsky and Sutcliffe over the course of many months between 1909 and 1911. The binders inlaid the cover with gold, ivory, and over 1,000 precious gemstones, including rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, set into a design of peacocks and elaborate patterns. It was said to be the most expensive bookbinding ever made up to that time. The book, of course, was intended as a showpiece of craftsmanship. After failing to find a buyer in England, it was shipped to the New World in hopes of sale. The Titanic was to carry this jewel-encrusted volume to New York City. But, well, tragically, both the book and its exquisite binding went down with the ship. In the immediate aftermath, the loss of such an object was reported in stunned tones by those who knew of it. The very idea of a treasure of art and literature sinking into oblivion captured the public's imagination. Unlike gold bars or securities, which might theoretically be replaced or insured, this book was completely irreplaceable. The artists had poured years of their skill into it. A bit of poignant lore grew around the great Omar, too. It was said that the binding was so magnificent, it was bound to sink, a darkly humorous wordplay in sight. Well, in later years, Sangorsky and Sutcliffe even attempted to recreate the binding a second time, but fate intervened again when that second copy was destroyed during World War II, the Blitz. Thus, the Titanic's lost Rubaiyat became an enduring symbol of the fragility of human art in the face of disaster. At that time, news of its sinking spread among bibliophiles and was noted in auction records. A primary source of our knowledge comes from the insurance claim filed for it, which valued the book at over £400, quite a large sum in 1912, that's for sure. For the average person in 1912, who, well, admittedly did not know about luxurious jeweled books, learning of this loss was like hearing that a tiny piece of a Renaissance or a relic of a bygone luxury had vanished beneath the waves. Well, if the loss of the Rubaiyat binding was a blow to book lovers, the loss of a great painting struck the art world in a similar way. Remarkably, the single most valuable item by monetary value lost on the Titanic was an oil painting. This painting, La Circassienne Aubin, the Circassian woman at her bath, was an early 19th century work by the French neoclassical artist Marie-Joseph Blondel. It depicted a life-sized figure of a young woman bathing, a canvas about 8 by 4 feet in size, almost monumental. The painting belonged to a first-class Swedish passenger, Moritz Hakan Bjornström Stefansson, a businessman and art collector. Stefansson interestingly survived the sinking. He reportedly saved himself by leaping into one of the last lifeboats at the right moment. But his cherished painting did not. In the aftermath, Stefansson filed an insurance claim for the lost artwork. He valued it at $100,000, about $3 million in today's money. Well, this was by far the largest claim for any single one item lost on the Titanic. Of course, the collections of feathers and all of that, they don't count as a single item. You know what I mean. And at the time, the size of the claim made headlines in the press, highlighting just how precious that painting was. And yeah, good luck getting an 8 by 4 foot painting into a lifeboat. Although that being said, they might have used the frame as a floating apparatus, a bit of a barge. Who knows how much is a life worth? So what do we know of the painting itself? Well, La Circassienne had been exhibited a century earlier, in the Louvre actually, in 1814. It was a beautiful neoclassical piece, though not as famous as works by David or Ingres. It seems Stefansson had either purchased it or was transporting it to sell in the US, and when he itemized his losses, that painting dwarfed all of his other possessions combined. So one can imagine the frustration and sorrow of the collector. He survives that harrowing night, but his prized possession, something that survived 98 years since being painted, is now gone, forever at the bottom of the ocean. And indeed, the painting effectively ceased to exist on April 15th, 1912. No color photographs of it existed. We only have black and white illustrations and descriptions from the 1800s. So part of that cultural tragedy of the Titanic is that it took this piece of art history with it. In 1912 to 13, art journals and newspapers noted the loss, and it's been cited since as one of the greatest art losses at sea. For context, that single painting's claimed value of $100,000 was higher than many lifeboats full of survivors' total claims. It's worth noting, however, that Stephenson never received anything close to $100,000 due to the legal limits on liability, which we will discuss. He and others received only a fraction of their losses. Well, besides the jeweled book and the painting, the Titanic carried not one, but many other rare items of intellectual and historical value. For example, there was a first edition copy of Francis Bacon's Essays, dated 1598, being shipped to a buyer in the United States. He would have been looking forward to getting it so much too, wouldn't he? And you would have had to wait so long back in those days. Months of an ordeal, finally getting the dream book. Just imagine that 314-year-old book surviving since Elizabethan times, packed in a crate aboard the Titanic. But that too was lost, robbing some library or collector of a great centerpiece treasure. And the cargo hold also contained numerous new books and publications destined for booksellers, enough that one historian remarked the Titanic was also a ship of books that never made it to readers. In fact, the New York Historical Society later noted that many shipments of books for the American libraries went down with the ship. They were a great loss to those institutions as well. And actually, still to this day, the USA has quite a good library system. Really, they're everywhere. And remember, libraries are free, so no excuse not to be well read. Scientific and educational materials were not spared. In Reading, Pennsylvania, a science teacher and curator named Dr. Levi Mengel eagerly awaited a shipment due from Europe on the Titanic. Mengel was an entomologist who had arranged to acquire a collection of 1,000 rare butterfly specimens from a colleague in India. These iridescent butterflies, some possibly undiscovered species at the time, were carefully packed and sent via London on the Titanic. The shipwreck dashed Mengel's hopes. All 1,000 butterflies, potentially the largest private collection in America, were lost at sea. When news of the sinking reached him, Dr. Mengel received a notice of his loss in the same telegram that reported the disaster. He could barely estimate what the butterfly collection was worth, not simply in dollars, though hundreds of dollars in 1912 currency, but in scientific value. That's a little bit harder to put a dollar sign on. Each specimen had been painstakingly collected from far-off jungles, and collectively they represented years of field work. So one can only imagine those delicate, beautiful things meant for glass display cases now dissolved or drifting in saltwater darkness. In the same stroke of bad luck, Dr. Mengel's son Arthur also lost a collection of rare postage stamps he purchased for $300. They too were in the Titanic's mailroom and sank with it. For the Mengel family, the Titanic sinking meant a double loss of scholarly treasures. Local newspapers highlighted this story, bringing home the readers The disaster's impacts range from human lives to antique stamps and butterflies. Nothing was spared. Well, moving on now, in addition to cargo shipments, many of the first-class passengers brought aboard astonishing amounts of personal property, and much of it, of course, great value. The immediate aftermath of the sinking saw these wealthy survivors and victims' families filing detailed claims for their lost possessions, and that offers us a vivid inventory of this Edwardian opulence. The U.S. Senate inquiry and subsequent court filings required itemized lists of property, revealing what had been lost in those steamer trunks and suitcases now resting on the ocean floor. The most famous example is Miss Charlotte Drake Cardezza, a Philadelphia heiress. Miss Cardezza occupied the Titanic's most expensive suite. It is the parlor suite, B51, 53/B55, along with her son and servants. But she survived the sinking, escaping in Lifeboat 3, but nearly all her luggage was lost. And what luggage it was! Let's take a look in her claim to the court. Charlotte Cardezza listed 14 trunks, 4 suitcases, and 3 crates of personal belongings that sank. So much for packing light. The inventory spanned over 840 individual items, itemized across almost 20 pages of fine writing. Reading through it is like peering into the wardrobe of a true Gilded Age aristocrat. She listed gowns from Parisian couturiers, dozens of pairs of shoes, hats, and ostrich-feathered boas, and sets of diamond and pearl jewelry. One item was a 6 3/4 carat pink diamond, valued at around $20,000, a ring alone that was worth more than a middle-class house at the time. In total, in the day's money, Miss Cardezza claimed $177,352.75 for her possessions. Astronomical. Once again, converted to today's US dollars, it's about several million. Stands as the largest single claim for property loss filed after the disaster. This claim, preserved in the National Archives, not only documents valuables, but also hints at the stories. You see, each piece of jewelry or couture had been carefully selected on her European travels. And now, they were all gone. Cardezza's claim illustrates the material lavishness that first-class passengers enjoyed, and how abruptly it ended. Well, let's look in contrast. Consider Mr. Yum Hae, a steerage, that is, third-class passenger from Hong Kong. He also filed a claim for $91.05. A modest claim was for the few belongings he had with him, likely clothes and a few personal effects. His most valuable single item was noted as a suit worth about $12.50. Yum Hae's lost property would hardly merit a footnote in history, except that the juxtaposition appeared in the claims register next to the millionaire's losses. It reminds us that the Titanic carried the full spectrum of society, and all classes, whether they were third, second, first, they all lost something on that night. Might have been a bag of simple clothes, or a $20,000 pink diamond ring. The gap between the $177,000 and the $91 in claims also shows that the vast class difference on the Titanic, a point noted by commentators then and now. But between these extremes were many fascinating claims of other first-class survivors. Margaret Molly Brown, the now famous unsinkable Molly Brown of Denver, survived and later filed for her lost personal property. Her claim included an extensive collection of fashionable gowns, furs, and jewelry destined for the social season, as well as something rather unique. She listed 3 crates of ancient models for the Denver Museum. Molly Brown, as it turns out, had been traveling through Egypt and Europe acquiring artifacts or replicas. The phrasing ancient models suggests perhaps scale models of Egyptian tombs or artifacts to donate to a museum back home. Which is, well, that's pretty nice of her, isn't it? Well, these crates were in Titanic's hold, and all were lost, depriving the Denver Museum of what would have been quite interesting exhibits. Brown, however, characteristically shrugged off her material losses in public, focusing her energy on helping survivors. Still, her claim gives us a glimpse of her activities, and the fact that even scientific or educational curiosities were among the Titanic's cargo. And then we have Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, a prominent American who survived the sinking only to die later that year. He lost something of historical value. He had with him manuscripts and research notes on the War of 1812, which he'd been preparing for a book of his. Gracie was a military historian. All his notes and documents went down in his luggage. Though Gracie himself heroically helped others and escaped on board a collapsible lifeboat, he lamented the loss of his work. In fact, he had to rewrite his Titanic survival account from memory. He published it just before his death, because even his first draft that went down with the ship was lost. The 110,000 feet of motion picture film shot by William Harbeck, the filmmaker, which we discussed earlier, also appear on the loss list, an invaluable loss for history, as those films might have shown us Titanic's voyage and people. What a shame. Oh, the wealthy Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss families undoubtedly lost very expensive personal items as well, though many of them did not survive to file detailed claims. Now, John Jacob Astor IV was the richest passenger on board, and he likely had jewels or art with him for his young wife Madeline, who survived. After the sinking, when Astor's body was recovered, on his person they found a solid gold pocket watch, a diamond cufflink, and a few $1,000s in cash, hinting at the kind of portable wealth that he carried. Not many people walking around with that kind of dollar value, that's for sure. Those items were eventually given to his family, but whatever else the Astors packed, trunks of Madeline's trousseau, for instance, all went down. Ida and Isidore Strauss, the elderly couple who owned Macy's department store, perished together when they refused to be separated. In a famous anecdote, as Ida Strauss was persuaded to enter a lifeboat, she handed her fur coat to her maid, saying, "I won't be needing it anymore." Ada stayed on the ship to died with her husband. Now that act of selflessness inadvertently saved a valuable garment. The fur coat survived on the maid, who did get off in Lifeboat 8. After the Carpathia arrived, the maid tried to return the coat to the Strauss family. In doing so, she reportedly discovered that Ida had left a treasured family brooch pinned inside the coat's lining, perhaps a final memento. And if true, that brooch was one of the rare Titanic treasures that made it to New York, thanks to Ida's final act of generosity. Of course, most of the Strauss' belongings went down. Many other first-class passengers had similar stories of jewels left behind in safes, fine paintings in cabin sitting rooms, or luxurious clothes still hanging in the wardrobes. All lost. But even beyond humans, treasured animals were lost on the Titanic, and their value was noted in the aftermath. The ship carried at least a dozen dogs, all pets of first-class travelers, and even some birds like chickens and songbirds. Only 3 small dogs survived, secretly carried into lifeboats by their owners. The others perished in the kennels, or after being let loose. One American passenger, Robert W. Daniel, had brought aboard his prize French bulldog named Gamine de Picon. Mr. Daniel survived, but the poor little bulldog did not. Witnesses later recalled the poor dog swimming amid debris before slipping under. Daniel filed a claim for $750 for the lost bulldog, a considerable price for the dog in 1912, reflecting Gummin's value as a champion breed. Another wealthy couple, William and Lucille Carter, lost 2 pedigree dogs and claimed about $300 for them. Even a flock of prized chickens belonging to a first-class passenger, intended perhaps for a fancy farm, were lost. Their owner filed a small claim. Now, these claims show that the Titanic's cargo included living creatures that were dearly valued by their owners. In the immediate aftermath, newspapers ran small side stories about the Titanic pets, a topic that offered a break from the grim tallies of human losses, yet showed once again the totality of the tragedy. Even man's best friend was not spared. And I really feel terrible for that poor bulldog, swimming around, trying to find some kind of safety. The poor thing. Anyway, the loss of these animals, well, to some people they might have seemed trivial to the loss of human life. But in 1912 people did take note, particularly since some of the dogs, like the French bulldog, were well known in pedigree circles. But whenever great wealth and tragedy coincide, rumors sprout in the public imagination. The Titanic is certainly no exception. In the weeks and years immediately following the sinking, a number of sensational stories and myths arose regarding the supposed treasures aboard the ship. Now, these were not grounded in official cargo manifests. Rather, they were fueled by speculation, survivor anecdotes, or just sheer folkloric imagination. But still, they're worth mentioning because they form a part of the historical narrative and reveal how people of the time sought to explain or dramatize the disaster's material dimension. One enduring legend was that of the cursed Egyptian mummy being aboard the Titanic and somehow bringing misfortune upon the voyage. The tale goes like this. It claims that the British Museum's notorious unlucky mummy, actually the painted wooden coffin lid of an ancient priestess of Amun, had been purchased by an American and was being shipped to New York in the Titanic's hold. According to the myth, this artifact had a history of causing death and disaster to those around it, and by bringing it onto the Titanic, the story goes, its curse doomed the ship. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, some newspapers breathlessly repeated the story. In fact, it's all about selling newspapers, isn't it? And survivors' accounts aided its spread. One survivor recalled that during the voyage, the prominent journalist William T. Stead, who himself tragically drowned, had been entertaining fellow passengers with a scary story about a cursed mummy in the British Museum. Stead was known as a believer in the occult, and he had published articles about that very mummy's supposed curse before. After the disaster, an imaginative reporter conflated Stead's on-board storytelling with the idea that the mummy was actually on the Titanic with them. Within days of the sinking, the New York World newspaper published an interview where this survivor recounted Stead's mummy tale, leading readers to believe that a real mummy was indeed involved. Story caught on like wildfire, of course, as you might imagine. The Titanic had a supernatural reason for its doom. Well, of course, unfortunately, the truth is a little bit more mundane. No mummy or coffin lid of any kind was listed on the Titanic's cargo manifest. In 1895, when researchers gained access to White Star's records, they confirmed no Egyptian antiques were on board. The unlucky mummy itself never left the British Museum, and it remains there to this day. Now, the myth was clearly a hoax, pieced together from Stead's anecdote and earlier yarns spun by occult enthusiasts. Of course, at that time, the occult was extremely popular, everybody getting into it. Watch my Aleister Crowley video. Goes for about 2.5 hours, but it's well worth it. In any case, notably, parts of the mummy legend didn't actually line up in chronological terms. For example, the story had Helena Blavatsky, a famous mystic, encountering the mummy, even though Blavatsky died in 1891, long before the Titanic sailed. Yet, people of the era were fascinated by Egyptology and curses. The tomb of Tutankhamun discovery was a decade later, sparking similar curse tales. So the Titanic mummy curse legend persisted in tabloids and folk memory, and even to this day is one of the most popular Titanic conspiracy theories, despite being thoroughly debunked. Once again, ruining the fun. But, we have to remain factual. In the context of 1912, though, it served as a melodramatic explanation, a way for some to cope with the senselessness of the tragedy by blaming an ancient curse, rather than some human error. Another persistent rumor concerned a supposed secret cargo of gold bullion in the Titanic's hold. The story suggested that perhaps tons of gold bars were being covertly transported, possibly by a government or a bank, and this fact was kept off the books. Taxes and all the rest. You know what it's like. Speculation ran that the Bank of England or powerful financiers had chosen the Titanic as a secure means to ship gold to America, and that this treasure now lay on the seabed, unrecovered. Why did this rumor arise? Well, likely because large liners did sometimes carry shipments of gold or money. For example, in World War I, some ships ferried gold to pay allies. And also the Titanic's owner, J.P. Morgan, was a titan of finance. Some theorists muse that he might have put a gold shipment on his prize ship. And intriguingly, there was a gold shipment loaded onto Titanic's sister ship Olympic shortly before, which got rerouted due to cold strikes, leading to conspiracy-minded thinking that maybe some gold ended up on the Titanic instead. However, like the mummy tale, this one does not quite hold up to scrutiny. The Titanic's cargo documentation lists no gold, and crucially, no insurance claims were filed for any missing gold after the sinking. But if you were doing it in secret, well, you'd have to cut your losses anyway, so there is that. In any case, in 1912, you could be sure that if a bank lost a chest of gold, they'd claim it. But the lack of any claims or official inquiry, well, that strongly indicates that there was no treasure trove of bullion on board. Nevertheless, the idea is tantalizing. Some early salvage proposals, which we'll discuss shortly, were motivated by the possibility of recovering this vast wealth. The image of sunken gold undoubtedly spurred a few adventurers. During the immediate aftermath, governments quietly checked their ledgers to confirm no state treasuries were missing on the Titanic, and by all accounts, none were. The real gold on Titanic, in a sense, was those feather shipments and jewelry cases. But the legend of the sunken bullion proved quite hard to extinguish. Surviving magazines, or even one 1930s expedition attempt, long before the wreck was found, a deep-sea diver entrepreneur sought investors by invoking potential gold down there. Well, there were other minor rumors. One story claimed that among Titanic's cargo was an extremely valuable diamond, a blue diamond called the Heart of the Ocean in some tellings, which of course inspired James Cameron's fictional plot device in Titanic film of 1997, which is an inferior film. I will say, it's not a bad film, but if you want to watch a real Titanic film, watch A Night to Remember. I think it's from 1977, something like that, or 67, something. But it is much better. Don't worry about the black and white thing. I think they have it in color as well, but just watch it. You owe it to yourself. In any case, the plot device of The Heart of the Ocean from James Cameron's film is pure fiction. While many wealthy ladies had fine diamonds on board, none was fine enough to merit that kind of law. Another myth suggested Titanic carried a rare collection of jewels from Emperor Napoleon that an American had bought, again not supported by any manifest or claims. The very absence of many big-ticket valuables on the official lists had led people to imagine maybe they were just there in secret. And as noted, experts like Titanic historian Charles Hass have pointed out that beyond the personal jewels of passengers, there's no evidence of hidden troves. But, once again, human nature loves a treasure story. And it is worth noting that the press in 1912 did chase real stories of value lost. They reported on the fabulous jewels of Miss Astor or Countess Roths, another first-class lady that were presumably now at the bottom of the sea. So much that a week after the sinking, one satirical piece quipped that fish at the wreck site were draping themselves in the latest Paris fashions and diamonds. While the fascination with lost riches was partly a way to underscore the drama, the Titanic was not just any ship. It was a floating palace, and its sinking was akin to a palace sinking with all of its treasures. In the public imagination, that elevated the disaster into a parable about the fall of pride and wealth. As one editorial mused, all the gold, art, and luxury of the Gilded Age ended up powerless against nature in the abyss. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of the Titanic's sinking, one of the initial shocks subsided and practical questions arose. Who is going to pay for all of this lost property and cargo? Could any of it be recovered? What recourse did survivors and companies have? The days and months following April 1912 saw a frenzy of legal and financial activity as passengers, shippers, and insurers tried to reckon with the losses. The insurance companies, they must have been panicking. Well, it is here that the story of the Titanic's lost treasures becomes an academic case study in early 20th century disaster response and maritime law in general. Right away, survivors and the families of victims began filing claims against the White Star Line for the loss of life and property. By early summer 1912, claims for lost property alone totaled a staggering amount, not even counting lives. All told, hundreds of claims amounting to around $16.5 million of the day's money were submitted for the Titanic disaster. Of that, a significant portion was property claims. Wealthy passengers like Cardezza led the pack, but many others added in everything from tuxedos to typewriters lost. One intriguing category was Schedule B loss of property, separate from the loss of life claims. The US and British courts received these itemized lists as part of the litigation. However, the White Star Line had a powerful legal shield. An old maritime law, the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851 in the US, allowed ship owners to limit their liability after a shipwreck if they were not personally at fault. You can see where this is going, right? Basically, White Star had argued that Titanic's sinking was an accident, an act of God in legal terms, or at least not due to company negligence known to them. Well, under this law, White Star's total liability for all losses would be capped at the value of any surviving elements of the voyage, which in this case was just the value of the lifeboats retrieved and some passenger fares. Now that was a mere drop in the ocean, no pun intended, compared to claims. In fact, White Star calculated that under this law, the limit of its liability came to around $91,000, approximately $85,000 for passenger tickets and $2,000 for freight, plus $4,500 for the lifeboats they got back. That's it. $91,000 to cover millions in losses. Well, naturally, claimants were outraged at this news. Not Happy Jan. Legal battles ensued on both sides of the Atlantic. By October 1912, White Star formally filed a petition in the U.S. court to limit their liability, declaring the disaster an unavoidable accident. Many American claimants fought back, trying to prove Titanic's owners were negligent. For instance, by not providing enough lifeboats or by knowingly speeding through ice, etc., which would invalidate limitation, of course. In any case, this dragged on for years, with investigations and depositions. Yet the practical reality was that White Star might well win the liability cap. Finally, in December of 1915, a settlement was brokered. White Star Line offered a lump sum settlement of $664,000 to resolve all claims, without admitting wrongdoing. By July 1916, after complex negotiations, the settlement was approved by Judge Julius Mayer in the U.S. courts. Now, $664,000 was far less than the $16 million claimed, but the claimants were persuaded rather to accept because lengthy litigation was uncertain and could result in even less if White Star won outright. Under the settlement terms, American claimants would get $500,000 of the pot, and British claimants about £10,000, which was about $50,000 at the time, and the remainder covered legal expenses and interest. When distributed, on average each claimant received only about 20% of their claimed property values. So, Charlotte Cardizza, for example, might have ultimately gotten around $35,000 for a $177,000 claim. Many small claimants got mere pennies on the dollar. It was, in a sense, the final blow of those passengers. Not only were these people stripped of their possessions, but they were largely uncompensated. Now, the logic behind this meager payout traced back to maritime tradition. To encourage shipping enterprise, governments had long limited how much ruin one wreck could bring to a company. After all, shipwrecks were a little bit more common back then. It was cold comfort, though, for those who lost family heirlooms or precious goods. Some notable claimants did not even bother to collect the pittance when they were awarded. Others, with no surviving family, had claims that went unpaid entirely. But by early 1916, the legal saga of the Titanic had closed. The White Star Line was officially off the hook. Well, in a poignant epilogue, but before we move on, the White Star actually never financially recovered its reputation, and by 1930s it had to merge into its rival Cunard. And some say the ghost of the Titanic ultimately sunk the company too, albeit slowly. Well, on the question of recovery of items, in 1912 there was effectively no technology capable of reaching the Titanic's wreck. After all, it's 12,500 feet deep. A little bit of water pressure there. So anything that sank was considered irretrievable at the time. Still, almost immediately, inventors and adventurers concocted wild schemes to salvage the Titanic or its riches. Within weeks, proposals ranged from sending divers in reinforced suits, far beyond the range of human diving at the time, or using explosives to loosen the wreck from the seabed. One especially imaginative plan, we can say, put forth in 1914 by a Denver architect by Charles Smith, suggested using giant electromagnets dropped from a barge and trawled along the ocean floor to literally lift the Titanic. Well, Smith envisioned powering these magnets by electricity from the surface and fishing for the wreck's steel hull, a plan that portrayed some ignorance of both the wreck's size and also the ocean's depth. A Dutch newspaper even illustrated the magnet scheme, and it captured public interest for some time. I mean, it all sounds good on paper, doesn't it, until you look at the actual science of it. And needless to say, though, the plan was not really feasible. The technology and knowledge of the precise wreck location were lacking. The wreck's location was indeed a mystery until 1985. Other suggested methods, including injecting some kind of buoyant wax or tens of thousands of ping-pong balls into the hull to float it up. This sounds like a joke, but these kinds of things were put forward very seriously in the later part of the century. Well, in 1912, one might more practically have thought to salvage objects that floated. But unfortunately, most of the Titanic's cargo was heavy and sank. The only items recovered at sea immediately, as we mentioned, were lifeboats himself and some flotsam. A few wooden deck chairs, light debris. They were found by passing ships. Most strikingly, the cable ship Mackay Bennett and others sent to recover bodies in late April 1912 did find human victims with personal effects, jewelry, letters, and money on them. To those families, those recovered watches, rings, or wallets became cherished relics, often the only tangible thing that returned of a loved one. For example, a survivor's father's pocket watch had stopped at 2:20. That was the time of the sinking. It was recovered and handed back. A silent witness to the tragedy, a little bit eerie. But those are isolated cases, and not really cargo per se. We can't really use that word for it. So the bulk of Titanic's valuables just stayed underwater. In the immediate years after, no serious salvage attempt was really carried out. The depth made it a complete fantasy. Insurance companies paid out where applicable. Many personal items were not insured, but the ostrich feathers were likely partly insured in London. Those insurers certainly took quite a loss on that one. And interestingly, the largest insurance payout was for a parcel of diamonds shipped via registered mail. A claim of $20,000 was paid for jewelry that a dealer had sent and lost. This did not get publicized much, by the way, likely for privacy, but it does appear in Lloyd's of London's records. Overall, insurers deemed the wreck a total loss and just moved on. But for the victims of the lost treasures, the aftermath was often more sentimental rather than monetary. They mourned the loss of things that had deep personal meaning. A mother's wedding gown that a bride had carried home. Family portraits. You can't replace stuff like that. Always grab the photo albums when your house is on fire. First thing you take. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff. Well, survivor accounts occasionally mention that these regrets were in passing, overshadowed, of course, by the immense grief for lost lives. As one woman wrote, quote, "We lost everything that night, but thank God my husband and I were saved." And indeed, many who escaped with nothing but a nightgown later reflected that material losses meant little compared to survival. Nonetheless, once safe, they had to rebuild their lives from scratch, which in 1912 meant reacquiring clothes, papers, jewelry, sometimes with help from charity funds. One fascinating footnote: because White Star was not held fully liable, some Titanic survivors actually sued the U.S. government decades later when salvage became possible, claiming that under maritime law that the wreck might be considered abandoned property that they still had rights to. Well, these cases started popping up in the 1980s after the wreck's discovery, when treasure hunting companies sought to salvage the rights. Suddenly, descendants remembered. Oh, great-grandma's diamonds are down there. They belong to us. However, courts generally did not entertain such claims. It was just far too late under Admiralty law. Official salvage operations and treaties govern wrecks like the Titanic. In fact, in 1986, the U.S. Congress passed the RMS Titanic Memorial Act to protect the site and discourage looting of the wreck, and by then some artifacts were finally being recovered, like china, metalwork, and yes, even a bit of passenger jewelry by deep-sea submersibles. But those recoveries are part of modern history, not the immediate aftermath. One thing that I suppose we can say, as just a bit of a footnote, is, well, those first-class passengers, second and third class, you must think about after losing all of their belongings, especially the richer people, how did they view life after that? All of those things that, well, for the first-class passengers, probably defined them. But after they lost them all and got away with their lives, I just wonder how they viewed all of that luxury. If they thought, well, why do we need things like that anymore? We've realized how little it matters when you're up against your own death. Suppose you'll just throw anything away to get on a lifeboat. Well, it's an interesting thought, I suppose. In any case, that is the video for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think that the Titanic story is just... it's always going to be a sense of fascination. Of course, it's not the only ship that sank, but it's just a more modern tale of that hubris of humanity, the quote, unsinkable ship. The prevailing theme throughout history, it's always hubris, isn't it? Too much confidence. In any case, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katy B, Lovely, and Poma. That's all of them on the top tier. Thank you very much. The list keeps getting longer, which is good. Yeah. Okay, that's it from me. So I suppose I will see you next time, okay? Thank you for joining me. Lots of love to you all, and farewell for now.